If you carried America's most powerful squad weapon in World War II, you had about 30 minutes to live once the shooting started. That was the estimated life expectancy for a BAR gunner, because the Germans figured out very quickly that the fastest way to cripple an American squad was to kill the man holding the automatic rifle first. But the battlefield was only part of this weapon's dark story. Before it ever returned to terrify Germans in the Second World War, the BAR would become the favorite tool of America's most violent criminals, punching through police cars and officers during Prohibition's worst years. Now, before we get into why Germans came to hate and fear this weapon so much, we need to understand what problem it was built to solve in the first place. And that takes us back to the trenches of World War I, where attacking infantry faced a nightmare that no existing weapon could fix. The basic problem was timing. Artillery could pound enemy trenches before an assault, suppress the defenders, keep their heads down. But that bombardment had to stop before friendly troops went over the top, otherwise you'd be shelling your own men as they advanced. And in that gap between when the artillery lifted and when the attackers actually reached the enemy trench, defenders who'd been hiding in dugouts would climb back up, set up their machine guns, and cut down wave after wave of men crossing open ground. Traditional fire and movement tactics, where part of a unit shoots while the rest advances, slowed everything down and reduced the amount of fire you could put on the enemy because only some of your force was actually shooting at any given moment. What armies needed was a way to keep up continuous fire while the entire assault line moved forward together. The French came up with a partial answer in the Chauchat. You've probably heard of it, and probably not in a flattering way. But here's the thing about the Chauchat that often gets overlooked. It was actually the first weapon to show that a single soldier could carry automatic firepower forward during an assault. French units used Chauchat teams not just to lay down general fire, but as mobile machine gun hunters, moving toward enemy positions with grenades and automatic fire to knock them out. The concept worked, but the execution left a lot to be desired. The Chauchat was awkward to fire from the hip. Its long recoil system produced an uneven kick that fought against the shooter, and external parts snagged on everything. American troops who got versions converted to 30-06 ran into even worse reliability problems. So, while the French had proven that man-portable automatic weapons could change how infantry assaults worked, they hadn't built the ideal tool for the job. Heavy machine guns existed, of course, but their weight, their cooling needs, and the fact that they required entire crews to operate made them defensive weapons. You simply couldn't advance across no man's land while dragging a water-cooled Maxim behind you. The US Army looked at alternatives, including the French Berthier light machine gun, which actually tested well with the Marine Corps and Army in 1917. But manufacturing and money problems killed that program. In the end, the job of building a purpose-made automatic rifle for what they called walking fire went to John Moses Browning. And by this point in his career, Browning had decades of experience designing firearms across multiple systems. If anyone could solve this problem, it was him. What Browning had in mind was something quite specific. He wanted a man-portable rifle chambered in 30-06, capable of both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, tough enough to handle mud and debris, reliable under the worst conditions, and fed from a magazine larger than the standard 5-round service rifle. The magazine capacity settled at 20 rounds for ground use. 40-round magazines were tested, but they proved too awkward for prone firing and mostly got set aside. Now here's the tactical concept that the entire weapon was built around, and this matters because it explains why the original BAR worked the way it did. A group of soldiers equipped with BARs would advance on an enemy position, firing mainly from the hip and mainly in semi-automatic mode. The purpose was to put enough fire on the enemy to keep defenders pinned while the assault line closed the distance. You weren't trying to hit specific targets at this point. You were trying to make every German in that trench keep his head down instead of shooting at you. Then, once the assault got to very close range, the selector would be switched to full automatic for short, intense bursts during the final rush and the trench fighting that followed. This concept has actually been compared to the later assault rifle idea, meaning a weapon used mainly for controlled semi-automatic fire, but with an automatic option when needed up close. The key difference is that the BR did this with a full-power 30-06 cartridge, while later assault rifles were built around intermediate rounds that were much easier to control on full auto. The BAR was asking soldiers to handle serious recoil, but the payoff was stopping power and range that lighter rounds simply couldn't match. One detail worth mentioning is the fire selector design. Browning made it deliberately stiff, requiring real effort to move, often needing 2 fingers or even both hands. The selector moved from safe, which was closest to the shooter, forward to semi-automatic, then forward again to full auto. Moving from semi to auto was easy thanks to a spring-loaded stop, but getting back to safe required deliberate force. This way, a soldier switching modes under stress couldn't accidentally end up on safe and find his rifle dead at the worst possible moment. The original BAR weighed around 16 pounds. Compare that to the Lewis gun at over 20 pounds. That difference mattered because shoulder fire was part of what the BAR was meant to do. You couldn't realistically fire a Lewis from the shoulder, but the BAR was designed for it when the situation called for aimed shots. The sights came directly from the model of 1917 Enfield rifle, which had an excellent rear aperture peep sight system, good for reasonably precise shooting at range. Production turned into its own kind of mess, with 3 different companies involved: Colt, Winchester, and Marlin. There were contract disputes, production delays, and at one point Browning himself refused to participate in Winchester demonstrations of his own design because of earlier bad blood between them. By war's end, roughly 52,000 M1918 BARs existed, and about 48,000 of them shipped overseas before the armistice. Even though BARs were arriving in France by summer 1918, with at least 17,000 in-country by the end of July, American units often continued using Chauchats at the front, while BARs piled up in reserve. And this was on purpose. General Pershing was worried that early limited use of the BAR would let German forces capture examples, figure out how they worked, and maybe start making their own. At the time, commanders still expected the war to go well into 1919, with major offensives planned for spring on both sides. Pershing saw the BAR as a potentially decisive weapon and didn't want to give it away too soon. His plan was to field it in large numbers all at once, equipping entire divisions at the same time rather than letting it trickle into combat piece by piece where the Germans could grab one and study it. Actual first combat use came on September 22, 1918, just before the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Early reports said it performed exceptionally well when firing, easier to handle and more effective than the Chauchat, which, to be honest, wasn't a difficult thing to achieve. Since engagements were still fairly rare and the rifle had limited time in the field, early tests often measured how well it held up under marching, mud, and lack of cleaning, rather than sustained firefights. The data showed that BARs were far less likely to be left behind during advances compared to other automatic weapons. When lighter guns broke down mid-assault, soldiers often abandoned them rather than stopping to fix them. And while 400 Chauchats got ditched during comparable operations, only 72 BARs suffered the same fate. The BAR came with its own dedicated webgear. 3 different belts existed, one for the gunner, one for the first assistant, and one for the second assistant. The gunner's belt was the most interesting because it included a metal cup mounted on the right side, designed specifically to hold the butt of the BAR during walking fire. Hip firing while advancing wasn't something soldiers improvised. It was official doctrine. From the very first encounters, the BAR terrified Germans who'd never seen or heard anything like it. American units reported capturing many prisoners who were simply too shaken by the new weapon to keep fighting. The armistice cut short the period when the BAR might have fully proven itself in that war, but the groundwork was laid for its fearsome reputation. But before the BAR would terrify Germans again in the next World War, it would play a role in some of the darkest events of the interwar years, and these had nothing to do with military service. When World War I ended, those 52,000 M1918 BARs sat in military depots and National Guard armories across America. Guard facilities had part-time staff and weaker security, which made them easy targets. And during Prohibition's most violent years, America's most notorious criminals took full advantage. Clyde Barrow made the BAR his signature weapon. He preferred it over the Thompson submachine gun because the .30-06 cartridge could punch through the thick steel doors and fenders of 1930s automobiles, something the Thompson's .45 ACP couldn't do reliably, which came in handy for firefights with police hiding behind their cars. On July 7, 1933, Clyde and Buck Barrow broke into a National Guard armory in Enid, Oklahoma, stealing 5 BARs, 46 Colt .45 pistols, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Clyde modified his stolen weapons by cutting down the barrel and gas tube, chopping the stock just behind the pistol grip, and welding 3 20-round magazines together to give himself 60 rounds before reloading. He was basically building crude versions of what Colt would later sell as the Monitor. The Barrow Gang's firepower was devastating against law enforcement armed with revolvers and shotguns. At a 1933 shootout in Joplin, Missouri, Bonnie Parker laid down covering fire with a BAR, while the gang killed 2 lawmen. One highway patrol sergeant recalled that the little red-headed woman filled his face with splinters on the other side of that tree with one of those guns. When Bonnie and Clyde were finally ambushed in May 1934, their car held 3 full-auto BARs and 100 loaded 20-round magazines. This violence led directly to the National Firearms Act of 1934, which slapped a $200 tax on machine guns. That might not sound like much today, but in 1934, dollars that came out to roughly $4,700, deliberately set high enough that most people could never afford it. Colt responded by developing the R80 monitor specifically for law enforcement, with an 18-inch barrel that brought the weight down to just 14 pounds. By the late 1930s, with another war looking more and more likely, the US Army decided to update the BAR. And this is where things started going wrong in ways that would affect soldiers for the next 2 decades. The M1918A2, adopted in 1938, was a fundamental change in how the Army thought about the BAR. They got rid of semi-automatic fire entirely, replacing it with 2 automatic rates, slow at 300 to 450 rounds per minute using a hydraulic buffer, and fast at 500 to 650 rounds per minute. The rate reducer was basically a complicated device that jammed up whenever it wasn't cleaned regularly, which in combat conditions meant it jammed up a lot. The changes added weight too. The original 16 pounds grew to nearly 20 once you bolted on the bipod, flash suppressor, and hinged buttstock monopod. The World War I-style rear aperture sight, which was actually quite good for aimed shooting, got swapped for a different arrangement that many found less useful. The buttstock was reshaped for prone firing. You see, the Army was trying to turn the BAR into a light machine gun, and most of these changes made the weapon worse at what the original M1918 did best without actually making it a proper light machine gun either. The bipod is a perfect example. It added nearly 3 pounds to a gun that was already pushing 20 pounds. And because it mounted at the muzzle, it actually caused barrel flex that hurt accuracy. Soldiers in the field often found it more annoying than helpful. The fixed barrel was the biggest problem compared to true light machine guns. Unlike the British Bren or the German MG34 and MG42, American gunners couldn't swap out overheated barrels during sustained fire. Accuracy dropped off badly after prolonged shooting, and the only fix was to limit yourself to controlled bursts. The funny thing is that FN in Belgium had offered the US Army their quick-change barrel design and better rate reducer back in 1938 to 1939, but the Army turned them down because it wouldn't work with existing M1918 receivers. So, what did soldiers actually do with all these improvements? They took them off. Lieutenant Colonel John George wrote that 2 weeks after they were on Guadalcanal, they'd thrown away all the gadgets, including the bipod, and were using the guns stark naked, the way old John Browning had built them in the first place. World War II production reached about 190,000 weapons. Training doctrine made the BAR the squad's only automatic weapon with a 3-man team: gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer. The gunner carried 220 rounds in 11 20-round magazines, while the assistant carried more magazines and stood ready to take over when the gunner went down. And that's the key word: when, not if. All squad members got basic BAR training because the Army expected designated gunners to become casualties. The BAR was the most dangerous thing to carry because eliminating that one weapon meant the whole squad's ability to put down suppressive fire dropped dramatically. So every German who spotted an American squad knew exactly who to shoot first. An intelligence report noted that in all infantry engagements, the enemy constantly gave priority attention